Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you for listening.
And come to France. Jefferson cultural tours. There are still a few places in the big October 20 through 29 Jefferson in France tour. It's going to be just an embarrassment of riches and beauty and art and music and the great Paris and all of its Jeffersonian touches. So if you're interested, jeffersonhour.com, that tour and the winter encampments on Charles Dickens and also on the American Space Program. But all of that by way of so many things that you can do if you're interested in the world of Thomas Jefferson. But today, David, our program is about sort of the very personal Jefferson.
Dressing down. So that's what, on the tour, are you going to dress down with your slippers
Always.
At your ankles and a bit of egg on your coat?
That's as you grow older, egg on your coat becomes a kind of inevitability. No, I'm not going to do that. But, remember when you were young and you would get on an airplane and people would have like jackets and ties on and women would wear dresses? There was a time in American life when people dressed for travel and dressed for church and dressed for going out to dinner. And today you can go into a really high-quality restaurant in New York and see people in their sweats. It's a different time, and so Jefferson was sort of anticipating some of this. He wanted to prove to everyone, the Federalists particularly at home, and the Brits abroad, that a republic is an unusual system of self-government, and it doesn't operate by the same ceremonial pomposity that exists at Versailles or the Court of St. James in London. And so he went out of his way, even though he was himself a very gracious and elegant man, to dress down as president and to show by sort of political theater the set of values that he was trying to embody as the third president of the United States. And this made his enemies really cynical and roll their eyes because they knew that it was political theater. But they had to admit it was exquisite political theater.
Because we talked about Jefferson, and it really centers around Mary, Ambassador Mary.
Anthony Mary and his wife.
Historically, he's more responsible for these descriptions than anyone. But I did a little bit of research looking up the clothes that Jefferson wore, and it's really sort of different pieces and parts and all that. And of course, if you Google search his clothes, one of the things that comes up right away is this extraordinary red silk under waistcoat that is at Monticello.
Yes. Pat Brodowski showed me, and several of my friends from Carolina, one of the greatcoats that he owned. And they have it in a special box. And first of all, it's very striking. It's a strong blue on the kind of the turquoise end of the blue spectrum. And it's also really small. He was a very, very thin, tall man. I mean, you can't even believe that it could have fit him. And of course, all these descriptions say his clothes didn't really ever fit him. They're always like a little too small for his big frame.
One of the more fun exchanges I have with President Jefferson is about living and where I live and where he lives, and how he chides me. I can't imagine someone living where it would get so cold.
Well, that's what he thought of Vermont and upstate New York. Imagine what he would think of Dakota.
In the winter of 1801, in a letter to William Dunbar, he lamented, quote, "I have no doubt but that cold is the source of more sufferance to all animal nature than hunger, thirst, sickness, and all other pains of life and death itself put together." He didn't like it when it was
Dunbar
cold.
was at Natchez. But Jefferson in another letter says that the sun is his sovereign, that he was really built for southern climates, especially southern France. And he said, "I'm a mere orangutan." Meaning I'm a mere kind of primate, just want the sensual satisfaction of a well-heated room. But he was broke, and so one of the stories that the granddaughters tell is that Jefferson would not allow fires in the fireplace after a certain day in April. And so no matter how cold it was, it's like, no, that's it. That's the day we stop doing firewood. And so the place was always cold. And the tea room, so there's the the dining room with the wine dumbwaiter, and then there's this double set of doors into this tea room, and it's exposed on the north end of the house. Very cold then and now. And so Jefferson put in a kind of insulated set of doorways so that there were double doors, and they would somehow insulate that room from the cold. He's always innovating, and he's always looking for labor-saving devices and cost-saving devices. However, in every biography it says, well, as Secretary of State, he lived in such and such a house for a few months in Philadelphia, and it had it completely remodeled during the few weeks that he was there. You just can't help it. It's like, I'm going to add a room here. Oh, I think I need some bookshelves. Oh, let's redo the kitchen.
Well, before we go to the show, I wanted to bring up the Pearson book, The Private Life of Thomas Jefferson,
Yes,
because
sir.
we talk a bit about that in there, and it's really an interesting book, and I think I said in the show, I'm almost certain you can find it online for free at Gutenberg or archive.org. But you mentioned the fires.
Right.
And him cutting. There's a great description in that book about he always tended his own fire in his own room. He would not allow anybody. He always had a box of good dry wood, and it talks about how he would tend it and cover the ashes, and if he came back and wanted a fire, he would. So he did all of that himself.
And he had
that was interesting.
It's so admirable about him. He had also this little cubby, and he would put in it like a little water or a glass of wine or an apple or something. And then late at night, if he wanted a snack, he wouldn't have
I didn't know that.
If he wanted a snack, he'd open this magic door, and there would be, because he didn't want to have to get servants, meaning household slaves, to attend on him. It's not like, no room service. So he's not going to walk down to a kitchen. The kitchen was somewhere else. There's no refrigeration. He doesn't want to leave his suite of rooms. And so he has this little cubby where he pre-stacks a little snack that he can eat if he gets a little peckish at 10 p.m. He's an eccentric. That's what's so amazing about him, is just how actually odd he was, and yet one of the great men of our history.
Couple of quick things before we go to the show. First off, thank you for indulging me and allowing me to pick your brain on this. I love these kind of conversations. It's in my ongoing struggle to understand the character of Thomas Jefferson. And then for more information, if you want to find out more about this and other things, go to jeffersonhour.com. We're real proud of that website, and you can find out everything you want to know about Clay's upcoming cultural tours, and there's some good ones. I heard rumblings of Cuba and a few others. So go there for that. And then lastly, if you have the wherewithal and would like to, we can use your support, either financial or even letters to the... we got a letter, by the way, from the gentleman who sent you the ham. Of course, had
great.
that, I would have never even known.
I wasn't going to share it.
Of course not.
He sent me an Easter ham.
And he wanted to know if you got the
recipes. And
right.
Yes, and I did, and I was so pleased. I've written to him, and thank you.
And because you wine so well, you also got stuff from Bo Wright.
Yes, he sent a shirt. And then there's a package right here in the barn that I have not yet opened.
We'll
Send
do that.
gifts,
We'll
people.
do that.
Send gifts, guitars,
Pay no
ukuleles,
attention to that man behind the
Jeep,
wall over there.
Wranglers.
We so
ranch.
appreciate your support in whatever way you can do it. You can become a member of the 1776 Club if that suits you, and you'll get access to many, many past shows. And if nothing else, write us a letter. Tell us what you like and what you don't like.
Before we go to the show,
It is time to go to the show.
You started this because you quoted William Plumer, and he has that great thing where he goes to the White House. He doesn't like Jefferson. It has never met him, and the door opens and he meets somebody, and he says, "I thought it was a farmer." It turns out it's the president of the United States, but Jefferson just appears like a farmer and says, "Hey, welcome to the White House." And Plummer's like, "Yeah, but where's the president?" "Oh, you're the president."
Yeah, that's a great
And
one.
Plummer became one of Jefferson's great admirers over time.
He was a Federalist, too.
He hated Jefferson at first, but then he found Jefferson's wines. One time, Jefferson served 7 different varieties of wine at a single dinner, and Plummer said, "You can't dislike a guy like that."
All right, thank you very much for listening. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, or your weekly conversation with the gentleman who portrays Mr. Jefferson when he's here, Clay Jenkinson, and it is he who is seated across from me now. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And happy to be. And, I asked if I could talk to you this week about something that's just stuck with me since one of our last episodes. We talked about Jefferson and dinner parties, you recall.
Of course.
There was a discussion we had about Jefferson and how he would appear while president. Could you, perhaps for people who haven't heard that episode, give us sort of a recap of what he did when he came to the door, how he appeared, how he dressed?
So we have a number of accounts of this, including a very important one by the British ambassador to the United States, Anthony Merry, and another by a New Hampshire senator by the name of William Plumer. But these are only two of many that suggested that Jefferson was a little shabby and that he often appeared at state functions or as president of the United States in dishevelry, that his linens were none too clean, as Ambassador Merry put it, that Jefferson was wearing slippers rather than formal shoes, that his hose, his leggings, were down around his ankles or were loosely kept on his legs, and that Jefferson didn't seem to take seriously enough the sartorial decorum of being the president of the United States, and particularly involving diplomatic encounters.
And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, because you know me, these first-person accounts just fascinate me, and I'm always looking for those. And it tells us something about Jefferson, that he would do this. There's a great article I found, the White House Historical Association website, and it talks about Anthony Merry. And it talks about how Anthony Merry made hay of this description of Jefferson. It was something that people always wanted to hear, and he was always anxious to retell this story. So perhaps it grew as he told it. But you believe this to be accurate, this description?
Yes, I do. I think that this is, so in my essay today on the Jefferson Watch, I'll talk a little bit about this, but this is what I call Jefferson's political theater. He was a very elegant man. He knew how to dress perfectly. When he was a diplomat in France, he was able to play the part with his usual attention to detail and fastidiousness. But when he became the president of the United States, he felt that it was important not to behave in a monarchical way or to be too imperial in style or to distance himself from the average American. 96 or 7% of the American people were just farmers. And so Jefferson decided to wear clothing that would signify that he did not regard himself as some sort of potentate or grand master of the American Republic, but just as a sort of gentleman farmer citizen. And he probably overplayed it a little. He didn't like Britain, and he was already disposed not to like the new British ambassador, Anthony Merry. And so Merry comes to the White House in this unfinished building in an unfinished city. Pennsylvania Avenue is mud streets. There are no wine bars. There are no bookshops. It's a deplorable mess. It's all what Gouverneur Morris called a capital in potentia, capital for the future. And Merry must have thought that he was at the end of the civilized world, not Philadelphia, which was quite a genteel city, not even Boston or New York, but in this grassroots new symbolic capital that Jefferson loved so much. And so he already doesn't like being posted to the United States. He's the British ambassador. He wants to be posted to Spain or to France or to Portugal. Instead, it's to this upstart nation that's recently won its independence from Britain. And he gets there, and instead of being really gracious, which Jefferson usually was in his life, he deliberately snubs Anthony Merry by dressing down and sort of saying, "Behold, this is what a people's republic looks like. And if you don't like it, well, you're in America now, and you're just going to have to accept it, because I'm not going to take on European or British expectations of what a diplomatic encounter should look like."
Well, there's a couple of things there. As you know, from what I've learned from you, sir, Washington would never have done this.
Never.
Adams would never have done this.
Not once.
But Jefferson did, and it was sort of his way to fight for republicanism. Is that fair?
Yes, it was political theater to say, we're not a monarchy, we're not a dictatorship, we're not an aristocracy, we're not an oligarchy, we're not yet an empire, we are a farmers' republic, and we shouldn't create this sort of mystical, ceremonial, pomp and circumstance world of the presidency. He had seen some of that in Washington, and more ridiculously, some of that in his friend John Adams. Adams wore a ceremonial sword and wanted titles and so on. And so Jefferson decided that he would walk to his inauguration instead of going with the liveried servants and carriages, and that he would speak plainly, that he would answer the White House door himself, that there wouldn't be elaborate protocol at dinner parties. He wanted to create a kind of a genteel, informal atmosphere of what a republic is, as distinct from any other form of government that you might have seen in the European world. And he was actually very successful at this, although it annoyed Anthony Merry and
many Federalists as well. Yes,
but most people looked upon this with sort of amusement that this is. You can just sense their cynicism. This is so Jefferson that he's playing this game. We know he's more gentlemanly than this.
Well, it worked. He was reelected in a landslide.
Because, Jefferson, this is so serious, David. Jefferson understood that this country is about the people. Now, he was an aristocrat. He was a squire. He was a wealthy person. He was a man of great privilege. He was a white slaveholder. Don't get me wrong. He certainly wasn't a sort of small d Democrat that emerged from some sod house somewhere. He was a man of extraordinary education and great civility, but he also thought, how are we going to make this experiment in self-government work? One thing we have to do is avoid creating a kind of imperial, majestical, semi-monarchical presidency, and he saw adumbrations of that in his two predecessors, and he thought, I'm going to break with that. Because, it's so hard for us to believe this because we have such a jaded view of politicians. But Jefferson actually believed in the people, and they understood it. They got it. They understood that Jefferson meant it, that he believed that people are up to the challenge of self-government, and so they rewarded him. He was an extremely popular president, and he was known as the man of the people, while as the Federalists, his enemies, or his adversaries at least, were known as individuals who distrusted the people, who spoke of the people as a mob or childlike. Hamilton was famous for saying the people are a beast, a rabble. But Jefferson was known around the country as someone who actually had serious, authentic, sincere respect for common individuals and wanted to build a country in which they were equal and they could thrive. And that is so rare.
I think it's really significant, too, that it started with his inauguration. You brought that up, that he walked. He was so afraid of this leaning towards a monarchy as he saw it.
Yes.
The fact that he did not use a carriage to go to his own inauguration is bigger than just that statement.
It's political theater. Now, it must be said, as cynics have said from that day forward, Jefferson wanted to make a statement. And it's hard for us to understand this, David, because
without the cynicism of our age.
And we know
sure,
what happened. We know how the story comes out. He didn't. And he and Madison and others actually thought the country was going to reinstall a British-style constitutional monarchy, or worse, that we might create a hereditary monarchy. We just laugh at this today, like this wasn't. What paranoia this represents in Jefferson and Madison? But it wasn't. They actually felt deeply that this was a possibility, that we were drifting away from the Republican experiment that we had agreed to undertake, and that if something weren't done to heal the system, Jefferson called his election in 1800 the Second American Revolution. If something weren't done to heal this corrupted system that Hamilton was presiding over, that the country was going to make a fatal decision and move into a European retrograde kind of high-toned, class-ridden, militaristic, centralized government society. And he and Madison believed that the whole future of the human experiment, not just the American experiment, was in jeopardy here. And so anything that they could do to bring it down, to take away some of this ceremonial nonsense, this pomposity, they felt that this isn't just like scoring a few political points against your enemies, that this is setting precedents that will have to be followed by subsequent presidents.
Well, referencing this White House Historical Association article by Gay Wilson.
No, she's a friend of mine. She's done a lot of work with Monticello.
It's a great article. It talks about rather than use a carriage, he chose to walk. This may have taken on the appearance of a small impromptu parade as he was joined by some supporting members of Congress and the Alexandria militia.
Alexandria, yeah.
Edward Thornton, British attaché, wrote that it was a performance. Local reporters stated only that the new president presented himself as a plain citizen with no distinctive badge of office.
I so admire this in Jefferson. In our time, Jimmy Carter was a little bit this way. He carried his own baggage. He dressed in sweaters.
Wear a sweater.
He was very much, don't think of me as special. I'm just Jimmy Carter, a guy just like you. And we got to see his family, and we learned about the difficulties of his children. And the whole thing was designed, and Gerald Ford was this way also, to calm us down after a period of imperial presidencies that began, I suppose, with FDR, but really flourished with LBJ and Nixon. And so this was an attempt to recenter the nation in a more Republican manner, even in our own lifetime.
We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Between segments, Clay, I wanted to give you the opportunity to remind listeners that we have another book club coming up.
The Jefferson Hour Book Club. We recently did notes on the state of Virginia, but the next up in the book club is Ron Chernow's masterful biography of Colonel Alexander Hamilton, the vile Hamilton.
If you would like to submit a question about this book, we'd love to get it from you, but you need to send it to us by June 27th.
By the end of June, and the book is Alexander Hamilton. Ron Chernow has written probably the greatest biography ever of Hamilton, and although it's not very nice to Mr. Jefferson, it's widely regarded as an extraordinary book.
Right. So if you want to send a question in, you need to do that again before June 27th and go to jeffersonhour.com, click on Ask, or if you want to find out about the upcoming books, go to jeffersonhour.com and click on Book Club.
Get started with your reading and send in your comments and questions.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week we're talking about Jefferson dressing down. We've started with his inauguration, really, and some occurrences at dinner parties at the White House. But when we took our break, you were talking about how important this was, and it really was a bold move to behave this way from the start.
Yes, and his many, many detractors would be rolling their eyes like, here he goes. It's not enough that he won the presidency and is calling it the Second American Revolution and believes that the whole future of human liberty was at stake. But in addition to that, now he's playing this sort of game. We know that he has the finest wines. We know that he has French chef. We know that he's an extraordinarily elegant man with perfect penmanship and the most orderly man who maybe ever lived in America, and is just a symbol of the complete gentleman. And here he is greeting an ambassador in his house slippers. His linens are a little unclean. What's going on here? What kind of demagoguery, I think they would have said, is Jefferson engaged in here? But I admire it. Politics is so many things. I mean, if you take some of the best presidents in theory in American history have not been great presidents because they couldn't communicate the thing they wanted to communicate to the American people. And I think Barack Obama fits into this to a certain degree. Presidents who have great virtue sometimes have a hard time with the theatrics of.
I think that's true. I think that's very true. You look at the other side of it, Ronald Reagan.
I was just thinking it. So here's a comparative lightweight.
Father of the country.
But he's like, he knew exactly. I mean, and you have to give him credit.
It's an art almost.
He knew exactly how to inspire, to be the ceremonial president. You think of the Challenger disaster and his remarks after that, the way he handled his near-death experience in the assassination in his first year in office, saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," in the tone that he said it. This was a master of what he did.
And often you and I have talked about Barack Obama's presidency, and I was worried early on.
I remember.
And that was one of the reasons why he didn't seem to have that connection.
But he burst on the national scene with that speech at the Democratic National Convention, and so we thought he was going to be inspiring every single day. He became a policy wonk instead, a kind of an analytic, professorial, left-brained policy wonk. And he made a mistake that Jefferson made, which he assumed that everyone was sort of like him, and didn't realize no. The country is filled with a whole range of different types, and most of them are not impressed by a highly articulate, evidence-based policy wonk. They want Ronald Reagan to hit the ball out of the park every time, and then they respond deeply to that.
I want to go back to the Gay Wilson article one more time.
She's great.
On Minister Mary. I mean, he was just aghast and disgusted by all of this.
As he should have been.
But thanks to him, it's a big historical item because he made such a big deal out of it. And from the article, Jefferson supporters lauded his Republican simplicity, while detractors maintained that his appearance was contrived.
It was contrived.
And politically motivated. British Minister Mary's young attaché, Augustus John Foster, agreed with the Federalist opposition that even though the president, quote, affected to despise drest, in reality, Mr. Jefferson knew too well what he was about. Foster based this opinion on his knowledge of Jefferson's background. As a member of the Virginia landed gentry, he was, in Foster's estimation, an American aristocrat.
Of course.
And he was.
So I mean, just imagine, by way of analogy, that tomorrow you got an invitation to go to London and meet the Queen of England, and you went out and bought a tuxedo, and you bought new luggage, and you had the best shoes, and you thought, this is my shot. This is my one moment of living at that high level of ceremonial costuming. And then you got there, and they greeted you at the door in sweats, and they're like, hey, we're watching a football game. Come on in. We got some pizza. We got some dip, and there's some Velveeta. And you'd be like, wait, you're supposed to be the king. You're required to be that symbol of elegance and tastefulness. And why are you slumming it? We expect you to do that. And that's exactly what Jefferson did.
But for me, it's like a key to understanding Jefferson's character. Think of his time in France. He didn't dress down there.
Never.
And, I mean, he was meeting with aristocrats. The dress was like the thing.
In fact, when he and his daughter got to Paris in 1784 in the summer, they didn't dare go out because they realized instantly that they were inadequately clothed. And so they immediately they just barely get their luggage unpacked, and they call for tailors. And tailors come in, it's like a scene out of a film. They're measuring them, and within days, they're getting the right kind of silk clothing and the kind of things that a diplomatic family is expected to wear. And Jefferson realized that whatever passes for good taste in the United States is really just like homespun and blue jeans in Europe. And so he spent an enormous amount of his salary as an American diplomat on costuming. It's the only time in his life that he wore wigs, because he felt, when in Rome, I mean, if you want to be respected in this world, you have to at least stay within the zone of acceptable.
Which is just bizarre to me, because he's hanging out with Ben Franklin. And I guess, not to get too far lost in all of this, is my point leading to my big question for you, the Jefferson scholar, is we see without a doubt that Jefferson will alter his appearance, perhaps his personality somewhat, to make a political point. So the question is, Where else did he do this?
Well, he did not go up in person to Congress to deliver State of the Union messages. He broke with the precedent of his two predecessors and said, no, that's what a king would do. A king opens the parliament by giving a speech. I'm not doing that. I'll write a report, make some suggestions. He wrote these very short, quite bland recommendations to Congress and then sent them by messenger, one time even by Meriwether Lewis, who was his aide-de-camp, and said, this is how it works in a republic, that you send your report. You don't parade down Pennsylvania Avenue and come in and, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, and then you...
He wasn't about that at all.
No way. I mean, his view was that way will create a high-toned executive which will be effectively a king, whatever we call him and however we elect him, and that will be the death of our real chance to be the most unusual civilization that ever existed.
Let me ask the question in a different way. We know by reading all of these firsthand accounts that he used this persona to further his political points. And I guess the question is, did he do that earlier in life? I mean, when I think about his early positions on the enslavement of people, he proposed a bill in the Virginia
House of Delegates.
Right, against slavery, knowing that it would fail. Was that part of his position?
No, he actually meant that. This is one of his first acts.
Well, I'm not saying he didn't mean any of this, but was that a positioning statement?
He collaborated with a man named Richard Bland, who was a seasoned, well-respected politician, and they introduced this bill that would allow manumission, and it was overwhelmingly defeated, and Bland took the hit. Jefferson is sort of a Teflon sort of person. So Bland was denounced as an enemy to Virginia for even talking about the possibility of freeing slaves, and Jefferson then kind of slipped back. He's learning lessons at this point. It's not that he's a posturer, because he meant it, but he also knew he was timid. The thing about Jefferson that's so important is that he was fundamentally timid. Madison is the one who got the Virginia statute for religious liberty through the Virginia House of Delegates. Jefferson is always proposing some extraordinary thing, some great innovation, some ideal new way of doing things, but then he sort of has a lack of political stamina. He's given the world this idea, then he steps back and he's working with his geraniums and he's bringing mastodon bones into the White House and reading Thucydides in ancient Greek and working on a paleontological project, and he has a little set of tools and he's always puttering around and inventing something and redesigning some object. Jefferson's a Renaissance man, and his view is, hey, I gave you the idea. If you want it, you'll pass it. But he did not. He wasn't like Lyndon Johnson up at the Congress buttonholing people and getting in their personal space and saying, what's it going to take for you to vote yes on the Louisiana Purchase Treaty? Jefferson believed that humans are rational creatures and that you just say, I think this is the right thing to do, and then you step back and assume that the process will take care of itself. And Madison's view was, are you nuts? Nothing happens without political persuasiveness. You've got to be in the arena. Now, Madison's not a great fighter either, but he's firm and he's steady and he has political stamina and he has a political aggression that Jefferson never had. Jefferson's view is, if it's going to ruffle some feathers, I'll just go work on one of my projects. I'm keeping 5 daily diaries. I've got new thermometers.
And maybe hire somebody to do my dirty work.
Yeah, that's Jefferson's timidity.
Don't misunderstand me. I mean, I'm not inferring for a minute that I don't think Jefferson was sincere in his beliefs and his positions. What fascinates me is sort of this discovery of how he used, call it political theater or whatever you want, to achieve some of his goals.
Yes, he did, and particularly during his presidency, not so much at other times during his life. But you can also see it, for example, in the staircases at Monticello, that a grand home of the sort of British style of the country estate would have this very big, prominent staircase, because when you had a party or when you had a reception, the master of the house would come down, it's like Trump at the top of the escalator in Trump Tower, would come down from the upper floors and then greet the assembled people who were literally beneath him. And Jefferson said no. We're not doing that. And the staircases, there are two of them at Monticello, they're so narrow that they're sort of a hazard. They're kind of a safety hazard. And for many, many decades, Monticello wouldn't let people upstairs because they were afraid of liability questions or just someone getting stuck or frightened. So this is, you think, well, that's not really smart. I mean, women, it must have been hard getting luggage, women with large dresses. It's a silly thing for Jefferson to have done, but for him, it was an efficient use of space, and it was symbolic of a post-aristocratic world that he wanted to help create. And I think he did that off and on through his entire life, but particularly during the time that he was the president of the United States. But the other thing that he did, which really annoyed all of his detractors and some of his friends, was that he was so profoundly modest. And so someone would say, "You, sir, are the man who gave us the Declaration of Independence." And then he'd say, "Well, it was a committee work, and I played a small part." And but he's always saying, "Oh no, no, no. This was the voice of the people. I'm merely the scribe."
And that had to be something he consciously thought about. Humility.
Part of this is the myth of Cincinnatus. The farmer who's called from the plow. Jefferson played that game just as well as George Washington, and he also did actually, I think, prefer his life at Monticello to life in the national capitals. But he also was doing that because it was a pose. It was the pose like, I'm so self-confident that I don't need to call any attention to my greatness. In fact, I will do just the opposite. And by doing the opposite, by being more than abundantly humble, it actually increases my celebrity, because then people are like, well, that is one modest guy. I mean, he won't even take credit for the Declaration of Independence. That's how great he is. And so he's playing a sort of political theatrical game in that too, I think.
But I think he was very serious about that. He maintained that the contests of the day, quote, "the contests of that day were contests of principle between the advocates of Republican and those of kingly government."
Yes, and there are two things I would like to say about that. One is that he wrote a letter late in life, his last letter to Madison, which we should post. It's in the spring of 1826, and he says essentially, what you and I achieved, how we presented ourselves to the public, the way we operated our administration, is maybe the best example in human history of a disinterested patriotism that's not political. We were doing it for humankind, and our intentions were always altruistic, and we were not self-aggrandizing in any way. And that's a really, really important and powerful letter. Now, a Federalist would say, "Oh, come on." Adams would say, "Right, go ahead and think that, but you too are a politician." But Jefferson felt it, and he meant it. And then in Notes on Virginia, which we talked about a few episodes ago as one of our Jefferson Club books, Jefferson says something that's really important. He says, "The time for establishing every essential right on a firm and legal basis is now, while the people are strong and their rulers honest." He says, from the conclusion of this war, meaning the Revolution, we will begin to go downhill. And so he thinks we have to establish the habits of a self-governing farmers' republic now, because the minute we're out from under this founding moment, the usual human needs for profit and materialism and a kind of political laziness and no longer attending to your affairs will begin to be part of this equation. So we have to get everything that we want to accomplish done during the high water mark of American idealism. And so he believes so strongly that Washington, with his levees, these weekly sort of ceremonial meetings, and Washington refusing to shake hands with people because no one could touch General Washington, or Adams with all the ridiculousness of the swords and the ceremonies and so on. It's not just that Jefferson found that ridiculous. He found it offensive to the idea of a self-governing people. And I do too. I believe that Jefferson was right in this. And now look at us. We've moved from, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, all the way on, with varying levels up and down, into this imperial presidency where when the president travels, say, to Japan, it costs $50 million. They send 20 limos and Secret Service agents in every direction, and there are costumers, and there are makeup artists, and there are people that only fold clothes, and there are people that attend to the protocol second by second, and no one gets near the president, partly for security reasons. But we've created this sort of idea. It's almost like Julius Caesar's Rome, where the dictator or the consul is untouchable and is surrounded by these cadres of flatterers and unctuous supporters and security. And so that means that the president no longer can do anything. Obama used to say that he would just give anything to go shopping. He'd give anything to walk into a Burger King without an honor guard. So this is part of the problem of modernity and the violence of our time and the visibility of our presidents. But Jefferson thought, no, if the president is inaccessible, if he creates these boundaries for himself, then he doesn't understand how actual people actually live. And instead of wanting him to do the right thing, people are going to look up to him as some sort of godlike figure, and that defeats the whole idea of self-government. And so he was absolutely right.
Well, it almost may seem trivial to bring up Jefferson's dress and his appearance.
It's not.
As a way of fighting for what he believed in, but it is him. It's a marker. It's a clue that he left us.
It is, and he would ride his horse around Washington, D.C. and go to vegetable markets and get off his horse and say, "Oh, that's pretty good-looking rutabaga. We're going to have some of that." And he's doing all those things to say, "I am not
a king,
and we must never allow ourselves to go that route." And if he saw today with the American people's fascination with British royalty, has the baby been born? Is it male or female?
What's his kind name? Of fun.
That's nuts. That he
it's
would
kind
be
of fun,
no. I'm offended. He would be deeply wounded by this, because he would say that's a longing. That's a longing for something we're better than.
We need to take a short break, Clay. Let's return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. In between segments, Clay, I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell people about the upcoming John Wesley Powell Symposium to be held in Vail.
I am excited about this. On Monday, June 17th, 2019, in Vail, Colorado, one of the most beautiful places on earth, I will be performing as the one-armed Civil War hero and explorer John Wesley Powell, who famously explored the Colorado River and its canyons in 1869.
Now, this begins at 5 p.m. at the famous Saddle Ridge restaurant with a cocktail hour, a sort of a social hour, and then your program begins at 6.
I'll be performing as Powell. The hard part of this one is having to cut off my right arm, but I do it because I believe in the humanities. But Saddle Ridge Restaurant in Beaver Creek is a very important place, and it has one of the largest private collections of American Western artifacts and art. So I'm excited. I'm going to Vail, Colorado in the summer.
Its location is really distinctive, too.
June
right?
17th, 2019, Saddle Ridge in Vail, or actually Beaver Creek nearby. John Wesley Powell, who wrote about how we should rethink Jefferson beyond the 100th meridian.
For more information, go to jeffersonhour.com and click on events.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Clay Jenkinson. You're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I am out of character this week. We're talking about Jefferson's style and the political theater that he used to show that he was not a monarchical president and that he was really just a first citizen, kind of a farmer politician. Dressing down, making sure people didn't take it too seriously, that he was merely the president, the presiding officer of the society of the United States, but he was not in any way an imperial man. And so I love this kind of a program. I'm glad we did it.
One thing we didn't get to, and I talked to you about it, is the Pearson book from 1860-something.
1862, Hamilton W. Pearson wrote a book called The Private Life of Thomas Jefferson, and it has a lot of these stories in it about Jefferson's sort of shabbiness, his deliberate dressing down and making sure people never thought of him as an American king or an American federalist.
And really, a lot of biographers have referred to this, and you find the stories firsthand. There was a Bacon was interviewed at length.
Edmund Bacon, who was one of his overseers, and a lot of these things come from Isaac, who was a slave, and Isaac Jefferson was his name, and he gave an oral report late in life that was written down, and that's a source of a lot of what we know about Jefferson is a personal matter. And then Edmund Bacon was his longtime overseer, and he left a memoir about Jefferson, and these are really important.
Yeah, he wrote, Mr. Jefferson was always an early riser, arose at daybreak or before. The sun never found him in bed.
And Isaac tells the story, Isaac Jefferson, the slave, tells the story of Jefferson's reading habits and says you go into his library and there'd be books strewn all over. That he knew where everything was, but when he was working on like the Batur case or working on some issue, he would have his books open in various places. He also had that many-sided book stand, the Lazy Susan book stand.
Yeah, I don't think you can just gloss over that. I think that's correct. He invented that. I mean,
he did.
In order to try to provide himself some more organization.
And to treat the books with respect, but it has these inclined little shelves that will hold a book open. And then the thing turns on a pivot, and so you can be looking at one book. Let's say it's the Federalist Papers, and then you can turn it and look at another book, which is Montesquieu.
Very much
and
like
so on.
working on a computer with a large screen. You could have different sources and references on this, and just jump.
Different
and jump
windows,
jump. Right?
Yeah.
I thought that was ingenious, and it kind of a clue to who he was.
It was, and it was for many, many decades thought to have been a music stand, and maybe it was. But the problem is that it's hard to keep the books open. So Jefferson didn't solve that. But, there's this whole theory of two types of readers, and I wonder what kind you are. There are courtly lovers and carnal lovers. A courtly lover will never break the back of a book, will never mark it, will never dog-ear the pages, protects it as if it's a sacred object. And a carnal lover just says, hey, a book's a book. I'm going to mark it up. I'll splay it down. If I spill some coffee on it, it's not the end of the world.
And there's a third.
What's that?
Which would be me.
Yeah?
E-books.
Jefferson was a courtly lover. He didn't mark his books. Adams is always marking everything. He's writing notes in the margins and quarreling with the author and looking things up. And marginalia is all over Adams' book collection. And Jefferson's are just pristine. And you can bet that he'd never put a book down face down to break the back of it because well, first of all, books were very expensive and they were much more. There was more to it then. A book was a really precious item in the 18th century. Today, books, are much so common that we treat them as if they're everyday household objects, when in fact they really aren't. But Jefferson had this book stand. But Isaac says the books would be strewn around because Jefferson's looking up a fact here and a statement there and checking a translation of Livy or Tacitus against the original. And so we get these little glimpses. And in this book, this really interesting book by Hamilton Pearson, we hear this, for example. He never ate much hog meat. He often told me, as I was giving out meat for his servants, for slaves, that what I gave one of them for a week would be more than he would use in 6 months. No, that's not earth-shattering information about Jefferson, but it helps us humanize him and understand a few of his quirks.
But he did like eating guinea fowls and preferred good beef, mutton, and lambs, and hams from Meriwether Lewis's mother. Were it not for this book, we probably would have never
wouldn't
known
know that. And
yeah.
so here's another one. After Mr. Jefferson got old and feeble, a servant used to go with him over the plantation and carry a stool that Jefferson invented, so that he could sit down while he was waiting and attending to any kind of work that was going on.
And even into his 70s, when he rode around on his horse, he was like straight as an arrow, it's written. But that stool that you're talking about, there's a really interesting story about a Baptist preacher, Mr. Hyder, and evidently he was an item, and people would travel to see him and hear him speak. He didn't have a church, so what would you call him?
A circuit riding preacher.
In this story about that, it talks about how he had the stool with him. But what I thought was interesting is this preacher didn't have a horse. He had no way to travel, and they took up a collection, according to the book, to perhaps help him to obtain a horse. And before the hat even reached Mr. Jefferson, he had already reached into his pocket to grab a few silver coins and went over and handed him to Mr. Hyder.
To get him a horse.
Yeah.
So
He's a generous guy. I mean,
but
he's broke, too.
He's broke, but he always supported all sorts of preachers. Even though he himself was essentially an agnostic and a Unitarian, he always paid part of his money for subscriptions to put up a Baptist chapel or a Catholic church. He was very generous in that way. But in that detail that you just read, very interesting, Jefferson didn't wait for the hat to come. He unbuttoned his overalls. Think of Jefferson wearing overalls.
And a Cat in the Hat.
Yeah, he's one weird dude.
Yeah, well, maybe. Anyway, it's Private Life of Thomas Jefferson by Hamilton W. Pearson, and I'm certain you can find this online for free.
Let me read something from one of the late visitors to Monticello, Mr. Daniel Webster, who went on to become one of the greatest orators and legal theorists in American history. Here's Webster's account of Jefferson, which gives you a wonderful glimpse of him in old age. Mr. Jefferson is now between 81 and 82, above 6 feet high, of an ample, long frame, rather thin and spare. His head, which is not peculiar in its shape, is set rather forward on his shoulders. In his neck being long, there is, when he is walking or conversing, an habitual protrusion of it. It is still well covered with hair, which, having been once red and now turning gray, is of an indistinct sandy color. His eyes are small, very light, and now neither brilliant nor striking. His chin is rather long, but not pointed, his nose small, regular in its outline, and the nostrils a little elevated. His mouth is well formed, and is still filled with teeth. It is strongly compressed, bearing an expression of contentment and benevolence. His complexion, formerly light and freckled, now bears the marks of age and cutaneous affection. His limbs are uncommonly long, his hands and feet very large, and his wrists of an extraordinary size. His walk is not precise and military, but easy and swinging. He stoops a little, not so much from age as from natural formation. When sitting, he appears short, partly from a rather lounging habit of sitting. It goes way back to that earlier thing by Senator Maclay. When sitting, he appears short, partly from a rather lounging habit of sitting, and partly from the disproportionate length of his limbs. His general appearance indicates an extraordinary degree of health, vivacity, and spirit. What a wonderful portrait of the ancient Jefferson.
And there was great loyalty to this man. It's written in there, too, about his instructions, which were very detailed. I believe if Mr. Jefferson told you to go into the fire, you would follow his instructions. So I have to thank you for a delightful conversation. It was a little selfish on my part, but I really like to get to pick your brain.
Well, Plutarch in his Lives says that it's often not the big things in a person's life that tell you who he was. It's the little details, just the way they hold their hand or something in their visage or some minor little habit that really reveal to you human character. And I think that's true in these details we've been able to put together today for this week's Jefferson Hour.
And with that, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch. I would remind listeners, for more details, more information, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can find out about Clay's cultural tours. There's a bunch coming up. But now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thomas Jefferson was a genius, and he was also an eccentric. It didn't really matter that he was odd in his own time, because the average American didn't really know anything about Jefferson, except perhaps that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, lived on a mountain in Virginia, and was more for the people than most of the other politicians of his time. He dressed down as the third president of the United States. This offended some, like the British ambassador Anthony Merry, and raised the eyebrows of others, but most Americans would not have known this about Jefferson, and they would probably have been grateful that he erred on the side of shabby chic rather than dressed in some quasi-imperial manner. Jefferson was a master of political theater. He walked to his first inaugural. His speech on that occasion was a masterpiece, one of the handful of greatest inaugural addresses in our history. But he spoke in so low and humble a voice that those in attendance were straining to try to hear what he had to say. Afterwards, people obtained printed copies on the street. When the inauguration was finished, Jefferson simply walked back to the boarding house where he had been staying during the transition and took his accustomed seat at the dining table far away from the warming fireplace. When a woman who was also a guest there tried to get up to yield her seat to the new President of the United States, Jefferson politely declined to switch places. You know that story traveled instantly across a wide geography. That's why we know the story now. The way Jefferson greeted Anthony Merry at the White House, down at heel, linen none too clean, was political theater too, a little sartorial lesson in democracy for a haughty diplomat representing a snobbish nation. Some of the things Jefferson did were not designed to make a statement about democracy or self-government. In some respects, Jefferson was just weird. All of the gimcracks at Monticello, the wine dumbwaiter, the lazy Susan pantry door, the doors into the parlor that opened simultaneously as if by magic, the calendar clock that required him to drill holes in the floor so the weights could dangle into the cellar, the whirligig clothes hangers, and all those things just seemed to please Jefferson somehow. But he wasn't inviting the national media, such as it was, to come to Monticello to report on his eccentricities. He was a very private man. He had a pet mockingbird named Dick that he allowed to fly around freely, sit on his shoulder, pick crumbs from his lips, including in the White House. That wasn't political theater. That was just Jefferson's odd personality and one of his many bemusements. If you have seen the great mini-series on John Adams, you see Jefferson sitting at cabinet meetings in the Washington administration at odd angles, nothing like the stiff Jane Austen novel posture that you would expect of the American Secretary of State. After hearing the Secretary testify at a congressional hearing, Pennsylvania Senator William McClay said, and I'm quoting, "Jefferson is a slender man, has rather the air of stiffness in his manner. His clothes seem too small for him. He sits in a lounging manner on one hip commonly, and with one of his shoulders elevated much above the other. His face has a sunny aspect, his whole figure a loose, shackling air." In one of the later episodes of the John Adams miniseries, Jefferson is home at Monticello during his retirement years. He's wearing a strange tall hat and some sort of a striped waistcoat. He looks to me a little like the Cat in the Hat. There is a possibly apocryphal story about President Jefferson traveling to or from Washington, D.C. with no security detail, no imperial costumes, in a public coach side by side with other travelers, none of whom he knew. They did not know they were riding with the sitting President of the United States. One of the passengers was apparently a high Federalist. He spent a fair amount of time denouncing this President Jefferson and listing Jefferson's many misguided policies, as well as his general political outlook, with a number of ad hominem attacks on Jefferson's private character. Jefferson made no attempt to argue with the rude passenger, and he did not identify himself. In fact, he asked follow-up questions to make sure he understood the citizen's full antagonism. When the coach reached its destination, Jefferson quietly excused himself and went about his business. And when the outspoken citizen was informed that he had been sitting with the President of the United States, he was, of course, abashed and deeply embarrassed. But the stoic and placid Jefferson was, as usual, unfazed. Thomas Jefferson was a cash-poor tobacco farmer who built his home not on the James River, which was the interstate river highway of Virginia. Instead, he built his neoclassical villa on top of a mountain, a design whim that forced him to begin by leveling the summit and then have an expensive system of roads constructed just to get to the portico. Whenever it didn't rain for a few weeks, his wells ran dry. He caused his slaves to build a 1,000-foot garden terrace on the south side of the mountain, something that would not have been necessary had he constructed Monticello on the banks of the James or even the Rivanna River. Nobody would call such a man a pragmatist, and this is just one of the many reasons Jefferson was bankrupt for much of his later life. When Anna Thornton visited Monticello in 1802 along with her husband William and others, she found everything so strange, notional, and even Gothic that she found it hard to accept that Jefferson actually chose to live in what was still an active and often loud construction site with such inconveniences as the narrow stairways that lead from the first to the second floor. Mrs. Thornton concluded, quote, "Everything has a whimsical and droll appearance," and she was not using those adjectives in a positive way. Not knowing that Monticello would never in fact be finished in Jefferson's lifetime, but perhaps sensing as much, she concluded that Mr. Jefferson is, quote, "a very long time maturing his projects." Indeed. Jefferson told his friend Margaret Bayard Smith, who had a huge, wonderful platonic crush on him, that any unnecessary felling of a tree seems to me a crime little short of murder. It pains me to an unspeakable degree. He grew and fussed over flowers in his White House study. When he left the presidency in 1809, he gave a geranium to Mrs. Smith, who breathlessly carried it away as if it were a nail from the cross at Golgotha. He was in love with charts, questionnaires, grids, lists, queries, and tabulations. To be sure, he had a kind of obsessive commitment to order and regularity, not beginning his day until he had bathed his feet in cold water, winding his calendar clock at the same time on the same day every week, etc. But one senses that even Jefferson's love of order was subordinate to his need to count, label, and catalog. It is possible that Jefferson today would be diagnosed as somewhere at the high-performance end of the autism-Asperger's spectrum. In my view, such labels hardly matter and they don't really help us very much. It's enough for me to know that he was a genuinely odd human being, eccentric, whimsical, droll. I like him more for his quirks. Give me a president who likes pets, who has a heart big enough to nurture something beyond his own massive ego. Margaret Bayard Smith summed him up. He could not live without something to love, she said. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.